Yeah, certainly. Superintendent Wayne Waltisbuhl. I'm with the Rural Fire Service, which is part of Queensland Fire and Emergency Service, and I'm the Regional Manager for South West Region. South West Region is a great place to work for us. It's a big region, it's nearly 1/5 of the state. It takes in all of the areas from Toowoomba right down to the border at Wollongara and all the way out to the South Australian border. To the north of us, we move up to Yarraman Way and follow the range country around out through the Carnarvons and back down to the South Australian border, south of Haddon's Corner. It's a really large patch of Queensland. Within the Queensland Fire and Emergency Services, there are 3 services built into that. State Emergency Service, the Rural Fire Service and Fire and Rescue. Fire and Rescue predominantly look after towns, and the risks that go with those towns and the built up areas are predominantly structures that they protect, a lot of road accident rescue, hazmat and other rescue style of operations that they undertake. The Rural Fire Service look after bushfire management and other areas to support the community in the areas outside of those operations. I've had a great career in the bush. I left high school and went straight into Forestry College back in '79 and worked my way through some of the forest centres around southeast Queensland in both pine plantation and native hardwood areas, and then moved into a role at Brisbane Forest Park as the senior ranger there, which brought into context the land management, the fire management and recreation management. I became a volunteer with the Rural Fire Service in '95 at Sanford, and I remember those days fondly, and I learnt my firemanship there. And then I got the chance to come over on a secondment to the Fire Service in '98, and I've stayed ever since. I've been through roles of a training officer, an inspector looking after an area, and then fortunately I was appointed as the Regional Manager to South West Region in 2006. So I've had a wonderful career, but predominantly in the bush and working with fire over the last 40 years. The progress for our department's been fantastic, and South West Region has just taken on a brand new regional headquarters here at Charlton, along with a new fire station that expands the operations for fire and rescue services out here, with the build up of areas at Charlton and the industry that's going in and an airport not far away. So our regional headquarters is being focused here as well. All of our services have come together under the one building. Fire Communications Centre, our building fire safety, guys from Fire and Rescue, SES regional staff and the Rural Fire Service staff as well. There's about 70 people working in the complex. Beautiful new building. Embedded in the middle of it is a state-of-the-art operations centre that's available to us when we get busy incidents around the region. Our operations look on the PPR process: prevention, preparedness, response and recovery. We want to spend too much time on the response, so we spend a lot of time on the prevention and preparedness, and we can probably remove a lot of the threat to the community. Preparing yourself for bushfires, if you're living in those bushfire prone areas, is so important to help yourself, but it takes the pressure off us then when we do get a major incident operating. People living in bushfire areas need to be prepared. They need to have a plan, they need to know how to protect their properties and prepare for the fire season. The Toowoomba escarpment is one of the areas in our region that presents a bushfire risk. The escarpment presents itself in a couple of ways. It's very steep on the eastern side and there's a lot of vegetation at the bottom of those slopes. Making sure that we've managed the vegetation on the down slopes from where people are living up high is really important. Likewise, people living up high need to be prepared for a bushfire coming up the hill towards them, making sure that their surrounds are clean, that if they've got land there, they can manage the fuel load on the land. We don't need to chop down all the trees and clear the ground back to bare earth. It's about managing the ground fuels underneath those forest types. That's a really important thing to do. Operation Coolburn is one of QFIS's operational periods, starts on the 1 April and goes through the 30th of August. That's a reporting period where we look at a range of risks across our region that we need to address. Those risks are identified by a group of people that form the Area Fire Managers Group. All of the land management agencies that have responsibilities for fire come together, identify high risk areas, and then we look at what solutions and treatments we can put on those areas to reduce that threat coming into the bushfire season. Our operations and fuel reduction programs are a 12-month of the year program. The vegetation around the escarpment area does present some issues for us, particularly being on the eastern side of the range. It's often cooler and moister, it holds the moisture longer, so therefore our window of opportunity to do any fuel reduction burning is quite a narrow. A lot of that vegetation won't burn. If there's thicket, it won't burn, but when we get really bad fire weather, it can burn. So that really presents us with some problems. There's some large forests on the downslopes of the escarpment. The trees aren't the problem, it's the ground fuels that we need to manage. So a lot of the landowners in the area, I think council are one of the biggest landowners down there, have done a lot of work in putting in fire trails and a fuel reduction program to prevent fires from coming uphill. Just because it's on the eastern slope doesn't mean to say it's not as bad as what we get on our northern slopes, which are predominantly more out in the open and provide much better fire behaviour due to just their location. We've seen winds on the escarpment coming in from the west but looping over the top in an eddy and then coming back up the hill. So we need to be mindful of how these escarpments and the weather impacts on those as well. On a bad fire weather day of extreme fire weather, all vegetation will get impacted on if we get an ignition source. Just because we're living in certain areas doesn't mean we're going to be exempt from that. Even people living in the suburbs with bushland not that far away still need to be prepared and be aware of what could happen to them. We don't have to look that far back to the Canberra fires where people living in houses in the middle of suburbs still were impacted by the bushfire, by the amount of ember flow that came out of that forest into those communities. So people need to be mindful that you're not always safe just because you're living in the suburbs if we get a really bad blow-up day. To undertake a hazard reduction burn is not just let's go out, looks like a good day today. There is a science behind it and a very tough prescription that we need to do to make sure we get the result we're after. The result we don't want is everything black, bark up trees black and scorching in the crown of trees. That's not an objective we want to do. Fuel reduction burn is removing those ground fuels. So we need to make sure that we've got soil moisture present that gives some fuel moisture to the grass that's there so we don't get big flame heights and great rates of spread. We need to make sure the wind is in the right direction. The wind is more predominant about the smoke management. We need to get people to understand that we have to burn to remove those fuels and we're going to get smoke from it, but we try and minimise the impact of smoke on communities from the wind direction. We don't always get it right because sometimes the wind just changes without us knowing, but we say good smoke is white smoke coming out of the forest. It means it's not a hot fire, it's burning just enough. If we see good white smoke around in the atmosphere, in the bush, it means people have got good, cool burns operating. So we advertise as much as we can to the community through letterbox drops, through messages on our Facebook site, through the ABC are pretty good at helping us out in letting people know that we're doing this. If people have effects from smoke, they need to be prepared to go somewhere for that day perhaps. And I'm not telling people to evacuate their homes, but if they have adverse effects, health effects from the smoke, perhaps that's a day they might want to go shopping or go and visit friends that are away from the area. The smoke won't be there long. It's a very short period of time, but we are very much aware, acutely aware of how smoke will affect individuals in the community. So it's probably one of our most highest priorities in our prescription is making sure the wind direction is blowing away from those built up areas. Rural Fire Service is predominantly made up of about 34,000 volunteers across the state. In our region, we have about 7,400 volunteers. Now, not all of those volunteers are firefighters. We need people within our brigades that do other things. We need people to look after communications. A lot of people just look after the administration. Some people look after the maintenance of vehicles. There's a range of tasks we can do. Not everyone has to hold the hose on the fire. But predominantly then, we do train a number of our firefighters in a range of skills and capabilities to allow them to address the risk that's presented in their communities. Each community is different too. Not every community has the same threat. So our training and our equipment and the number of people we get vary from brigade to brigade. Some of our brigades are just farming communities, and the people from those communities might come together once a month to do some training, make sure their equipment's ready to go and they're available. Other communities are quite responsive to a number of major incidents. Brigades such as Canberra, highly proficient, a very range of equipment they've got down there. They train regularly, once a week, and are often operating, doing business on weekends as well. So there's a dynamic change between different areas, and it's predominantly driven by the risk in their community and the people within those brigades that want to continue to drive that. So people in the community want to get involved with their local rural fire brigade. There's a couple of ways they can do that. Often at the station, there's a phone number, and they can ring that number and talk to the local people in the brigade, or they can go to our website, ruralfireservice.qld.gov.au, and the application forms are on there. You can fill an application form out and mail it into the local area office. If people see fire and it's an emergency, we need them to ring one phone number, 000. 000 brings you into our dispatch communication centre, and they will dispatch the right resource and the right amount of people to address the incident that you've rung up to report on us. It's important that you make that call quickly. Don't ever be embarrassed about making a call that turns out to be not much when we get there. We'd rather get there and find out that it's only a small job and deal with it than wait a period of time when the job's escalated and we need multiple resources to come and sort it out. 000 is your first call. The call takers will walk you through all the information that you need to provide to them to make sure we can get the accurate response to that incident. The Toowoomba escarpment does present a fairly major risk to the communities living along that escarpment. It's quite a big area that we're looking at here, and there's a lot of bushland down below. And people living in those areas want to live in the bush for obviously the views and the lifestyle that they've got there. Living in these areas will present to you some risks, and the biggest risk there is bushfire. There's a lot of activities going on with people managing the land that they're on to reduce that impact of bushfire on communities. And that goes across the board for everywhere, not just along the escarpment area. But we recognise that. We've seen some major incidents there back in the early 2000s. 2002 was the last major fire that impacted that area. We've learned a lot from then. We've got a lot of different machinery, aircraft, and the way we operate with our partner agencies has changed a lot over the last 19 years as well. So we think we're in a very good place to manage that now. And to be able to work with community groups like the Toowoomba Escarpment group is really good for us to get a real good feel of what the community need and what we can provide the community, and come to that understanding and educating each other about what are the real risks, the perceived risks, and what are we doing with the risks at the same time. Managing bushfires is a partnership. Every landowner has a responsibility to manage their property for bushfires. Whether you are on a rural property that has vegetation on it, or you're a person living in suburbs, you still need to be aware of those risks around you. If you own rural properties, the responsibility for fire management lies with you. The fire services will come and support you and give you advice on how to go about preparing your property, but at the end of the day, it is your risk and you need to manage that risk. That goes for all landowners, whether you're a government agency, councils or private land ownership. The risk lies with you as a landowner, but we are here to support you in reducing that risk and preparing your properties leading up to the fire season.